Hello and welcome to Terrain Oddity. My name is Jay and today I'm going to be showing you how to make these very large trees for wargaming. You could use them for D&D and they're essentially to represent a massive tree, generally on 28mm scale, but you could change the size depending on what scale you were playing. If you were playing some like 15mm, something like that. But I'm going to show you how to make these. We'll talk about the materials used, etc. At the end of the video we'll talk about pros and cons of doing it this way. And if at the end of this video you like the video, do consider pressing like, that really does help. And if you want to subscribe to see more terrain for wargaming tutorials, then this is the place. This is what this channel is designed for, so please consider doing that. So on with how to make these. There are a couple of ways of doing it. I have done a way on my old channel, my Star Wars Legion channel, where I make them sort of using like tissue paper. This way is essentially clay, a postal tube and clay, which is very similar to some other people, and I'll try and leave links in the description below. I know that Star Builds did something like this, and the Terrain Studio, Sean, he did one using like string. But the reason I'm doing this tutorial is there's a few extra little and different things I'm doing in this video from other videos. So yeah, we'll get on and I'll show you how it's all done. So the postal tubes that I'm using are 50mm in size. You can generally get them in 50mm, 75mm, and that's basically 5cm in diameter. And I'm going to be using Das drying clay. You could probably use other kinds of clay, but Das is reasonably cheap, so I'm using that and it's readily available. But the first thing we're actually going to do is cut the postal tube to the right height. I'm using about 12 inches. I haven't done exactly 12 inches because I wanted a bit of variety, but that's about a 30cm ruler. And once you've cut your tube, save you a little bit because you could always use that for a small stump if you want. But save that extra little bit. And then one of the key differentiators between this build and say other builds is what I'm actually going to do is use tin foil / aluminum foil / aluminium foil, depending on where you're from. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off a big piece of it and I'm going to scrunch it up like in a tight circle. Essentially we're going to be taping this to the tube to give sort of natural undulations to the tube, because a tree isn't necessarily perfectly round. So what we're going to do is, instead of having, like as I talked about at the start, Sean had a rope. Some people have just used clay. I'm actually using this tinfoil just to add a bit of like natural shapeliness to the tree. And essentially I would recommend maybe 3, 4 or 5 strands of this. You could go crazy and have more, you could go less if you wanted. And what you do is you just roll it out quite a bit and then just scrunch it up into a big like sausage of the tin foil / aluminum foil, whatever you want to call it. And then I'm using masking tape to tape that to the tube, and masking tape is quite a common material to use over tin foil for sculpture. So this is perfectly normal. This is generally a lot of how a lot of people will sculpt. Like if you're going to make a giant bust or something, you could in theory have the internals of this aluminium foil. So tape that with masking tape. For the start, I'm just going to tape it at the top and the bottom because eventually I'm going to cover the whole thing in masking tape. So once you've done all of your strands and you're happy that you've got your 3, your 4, whatever many you're taping to the tube, and you've like push it against the tube to scrunch it up because you want it to be, you don't want it to be sticking out. You want it to be natural, like undulations. Once you've got your tinfoil strips taped onto the tube, for the ends of that you can actually just like either cut it off or you can like wrap it in so that the tinfoil goes into the tubes if you like. Now what I actually do on a secondary part of this is to use the tinfoil as a base for the roots, so you can actually like make little sausages in an L shape and tape them to the bottom of your base, and that'll give you a substructure for your roots. And so if you have got your big tubes down the side, your big like aluminium parts, you want to sort of make sure you've got a root coming off that, otherwise it won't look very natural. But once you're happy with your roots, you can just tape literally the whole thing up so that you don't want any of the tinfoil showing, because the tinfoil isn't going to stick to the clay very well. Once everything's covered in the masking tape, what we're going to do is get the clay. So it's a simple way you take it out of the pack. 1 kilogram of clay made 3 of these size trees. Your mileage may vary, but I wanted to get as much mileage as possible. So what I actually did was used a rolling pin, preferably do this on some baking paper, so non-stick paper, and I just rolled out the clay as much as possible. Now, in my head, I was like doing some mathematics here. I was doing like, oh, well, if my diameter is 5 centimeters, and if I times that by pi, that's the exact size I wanted. I wanted a 16 by 30 centimeter bit of clay, which is all well and good if you can roll it out that much, but I am definitely not talented enough to do that, so I had to do mine in bits. I do recommend rolling it out though if you've got an old rolling pin, just because you want to get it thin, and it's a lot easier to apply if you've got these thin sheets. If you're just like putting it on with your hand individually, it's going to take you a long time, and we don't really need to do that, because the reality is we just need the clay for the texture. We don't really need it to be super thick. We don't need it for the substance, and if anything, the lighter, the thinner you get this, the lighter your tree is going to be, which is going to be good for like carrying them around. You don't want to be super heavy. So to get the clay, once you've rolled out your clay that you're happy with, to get it to stick to your tree, I highly recommend getting some PVA and maybe a little bit of dab of water and just rub it on the tree where you're going to put the clay, because quite frankly the clay will not stick very well if it's starting to dry, etc. Having the PVA on the tree will definitely help a little bit there, and I would recommend, once you've got your clay on the tree, get a bit of like a pot of water or something, dab your hand in the water, and we're going to rub the tree. It can be a little bit weird rubbing this big giant cylinder or what have you, but get water on your hands and you just want to smooth it all out. Once you've done that and you've got bits left, roll up some more clay and just cover the whole thing in a very thin sheet of clay. Once you've got the bulk of the clay on your tree, you could start putting in the texture on the bulk of the base of the tree, and to do that I'm going to be using like this plastic fork, but any like plastic knife or just a sharp object will do, and we're just going to score lines on the tree. But to be honest, until you've put on the roots and you've got the whole thing on there, your hands are probably going to rub some of it off, so I actually recommend doing the roots first. And you just do that. If you've used tin foil, all you're simply going to do is put clay on that, and it's going to be easy enough. If you've not used the tin foil and masking tape method for the roots, then all you need to do is make giant, not giant, biggish sausage shaped clay, and just, do like L shapes against the clay, and just make the roots look, as natural as you can. It's sculpture at the end of the day. You can essentially just sculpt the roots to look how you like them, how you want them to. And once you're happy with you've got clay on absolutely everything, including the top bit, then we can start carving it in. I have this plastic fork, which was, just out of a cutlery set for like parties or what have you, and you just scrape it down the tree. You could get a wire brush if you wanted, but I think that'd be too messy. I think the easiest thing here is just this plastic fork and just drag it all the way down, straight lines. You can do a little bit of curve if you, well, not a curve, but like diagonal lines if you want, but honestly, straight lines, or not perfectly straight lines, maybe slight diagonals, just whatever gives you a nice like realistic look is perfectly fine. You can do little knots in the tree by just doing little holes in the clay if you want to. You could, if you wanted, do extra branches by doing extra sausages halfway up and sticking it to the sides of the tree. I haven't done anything that, because if I want to transport these, I wanted to keep the profile as small as possible. But yeah, we're just going to cover the whole thing in clay and do these straight lines with this fork, and you get a really nice tree-like texture. And on the base, right where the roots, if I put it on the baking tray paper, because I didn't want it to stick, and you wanted it to be like you wanted to make sure the tree was straight. You're just going to do the same thing. Have the roots so you've got a few little like roots sticking off so it looks natural, and then if you can't get in there with your fork, get in there with your finger, get in there with your nail, get in there with the end of the fork or a knife or whatever you, and you're just carving these lines. Essentially, it's pretty easy. For the very top, we're simulating a very tall tree. We're not actually saying that this tree would have been this tall in reality, but just for my own sake, what I did was I just got a little bit of the fork, like the one strand of the fork, and just did like circles on it, and then smoothed it off with my finger, because I didn't want it to be like too obvious, but I wanted something up there just to have a little bit of texture, because the flatness would look a little bit weird. So essentially, it's covered the whole thing in clay. Use a fork to do like not necessarily straight lines, but like slightly off straight lines, so like slightly diagonal down. Use a fork, do that all over the main part of the tree, all over the roots, and you're pretty much good to go. Let that dry. Drying time will probably take 48 hours depending on how thick you've done the tree. And what I would recommend is after about 24 hours, take it off the paper, because the underside of your tree might not quite have dried. Now you can either, for the underside, you can either use clay and cover in the circle, like the hole at the bottom, or you can just leave a hole in the bottom. It's completely like up to you. So for painting, it was pretty easy. I just sprayed the whole thing in black paint, a matte black. You don't have to, you could just go in with your initial color of brown if you wanted, but I really wanted this like black to give me this like serious shading. And then essentially I did a very heavy dry brush / overbrush of burnt umber, which is just a very dark brown. And it, you know, that in itself with the shading give quite a nice look. And then for the extra dry brushing was a little bit tricky. I ended up using like this khaki color, which really brought out the detail on the tree, but the problem was it didn't look very natural. And if you try like a lighter chocolatey brown, again it doesn't look very natural because trees are sort of grey. So once I'd gone over it with this khaki colour and it brought out all the detail, I decided to go back over it with raw umber, which is like a very dark grey browny green, and that was perfect. That was exactly what I would have wanted. I think if you do an unnatural dry brush on this to pick out all the details, because of the size of the tree, it just won't look very natural. Whereas once I dry brushed it and then sort of darkened it down with another dry brush, it slightly like lightened the raw umber a little bit, and it was very subtle highlight, and it was pretty damn perfect. And because of the khaki and the original burnt umber, it had like this natural variation in colour, and I really enjoyed those colours. And those are two colours you can probably get hold of very easily. So all in all, I mean, you could, if you wanted, not use the tin foil / aluminium foil and just put clay on it and then do your roots with the clay and, you know, cover the whole thing in clay and be done. But it's very subtle, you can't really see on this, but maybe if I do this, you'll see maybe it's not a perfect circle. And I really enjoyed that. So using the tin foil and the masking tape, whilst optional, I think they're both really cheap materials as well, so they're not exactly expensive. Really like added a bit of something to the shape of the tree. You could either use 2, 3, 4 different ones, strands if you like. You could even go more mental and do loads and loads if you really wanted. But I think it really provides a nice effect. Covered that in masking tape, using some tin foil for the base if you want. I wonder if in this one, oh, you can't see, I've covered them both up. On this one, what I actually did was I used clay at the bottom on both of these when I was doing the roots. So like I've got a sheet of clay and put it on the clay, just so it would cover the bottom. You don't necessarily have to do that, that's sort of completely optional. But it, you know, whatever you want for the base essentially. Cover the whole thing in clay, and then it was hard to explain, but you can see maybe that these lines aren't like perfectly straight down. Some of them are, but a lot of the times I've gone like slightly off kilter, so I've gone like diagonal a little bit. Just something to give a little bit of variance. Follow that through to the roots as well, and you're pretty much good to go. I used a plastic fork, but you could use a knife, an actual fork if you wanted. Just don't get told off by whoever would tell you off for stealing a fork or what have you. And then that's pretty much it, really. Once you've got clay, you're carving it into clay. It's pretty easy once you've got that on. I used the rolling pin to get really thin sheets. I think that really speeds it up. If I would have had to have got a bit of clay out, stuck it on with my thumb, wet my thumb, I think it would have been there all day. Just buy a cheap rolling pin if you have to, because it becomes an absolute mess. That rolling pin's not necessarily useful after it. Once you've done that, you're happy with the way it looks. Do one first as a test before you do all of them. I sprayed it black, dry brushed it with burnt umber, and essentially you could go straight into raw umber just to give it an extra taste, extra like variance, but I did a little bit of khaki, and then I went back with the raw umber, and that really toned it down. And I think that on the table they are going to look pretty sensational, and I'll try and put a few pictures. All in all, that's it. They're pretty cheap to do. The clay costs about £7 for a kilogram from Das Clay, something like that, and I made 3 trees with it. I don't think it did extend to 4, but you could maybe try. So what's that, £7 for 3 trees, and then I think the tubes are maybe like £2 each, something like that. So what you're looking at there really isn't very much. What is that, £4 a tree? Fine. Time wise, not very long actually, really. An hour a piece maybe, in terms of working. Obviously you've got to let it dry and stuff like that, but actual work effort it's probably only about for an hour, so that's not bad. Maybe even less. You could whack out 3 of them, I reckon, in about 2 hours worth of work, but you know, you're doing one at a time, bit more of a pain. But all in all, I'm really happy with them. I think they look fantastic. They're pretty solid. I'm not going to hit myself any harder than that, because I'll be even more stupider than I already am. Yeah, I really enjoy them. Pretty easy. I thought I'd do a video because I use this like tinfoil method and this masking tape method. I realised StyleBuilds had already done it. Sean already done one with his thing, and I'd already done one myself where I was using. Well, I tried just using tissue paper and then hot glue. What I realised when I used hot glue, I should have really covered the whole thing in hot glue. But I was like, the time and the effort it would take to do everything in hot glue probably isn't worth it. On my old trees, what I did was I was doing specific strands, whereas I feel like you should do the whole thing in hot glue. But hot glue is a method if you want to do that. Tissue paper is a method, but I honestly think the clay method is probably the nicest looking one. But it's also the messiest. Anyway, if you want to see more terrain, do subscribe to the channel. If you like this video, do like. You should definitely, though, have a most beautiful day, and goodbye.